Have you ever started a large project and didn't know how to get going on it? And finally the project is starting and now you're faced with a decision because circumstances have caused to the point where you can't turn back. You're in the middle of it. You've gone too far. You're too far away from both ends. You can't stop the project. You can't get it done until you get to the end. Well, that's exactly what had happened to the nation of Israel in the conquest of the Promised Land. Those 5 Amorite kings had caused the nation to jump into that central conquest of that land. They're in the middle of the Promised Land. And in this section here in the Bible, as we pick up in chapter, where we're going to pick up here in chapter 10, verse 29, we find the nation taking the conquest down into the southern campaign that goes even further down below where they were here to begin with. And that's going to be followed by the northern campaign second. And these passages trace Joshua's campaign from city to city. Boom, boom, boom. And the writer only gives us a little snippet of detail about each. And so the land covered in these passages, I'm telling you, this campaign's not fast from the south to the north. It's going to take several years. But here in these passages, the writer just tells us a little bit. So we'll just pause a little bit as we get into it with each one, because it's all here. The whole campaign is here. When we get through with today's lesson, we're done with the campaign, and the land's been taken. So the campaign of Joshua in Israel was in full force, and the conquest in southern Canaan could not wait. Joshua had slain the people back there at Makkedah, killed the kings, buried them in the cave, and from Makkedah, Joshua had moved over to Libnah, and the nation of Israel would march. Chapter 10, verse 29. Then Joshua and all Israel with him passed from Makkedah to Libnah and fought against Libnah. The Lord gave it also with its kings into the hand of Israel, and he struck it, and every person was in it with the edge of the sword. He left no survivor in it. Thus he did to its kings just as he had done to the kings of Jericho. So Libnah is just a short distance away, west of Makkedah. And the attack on Libnah was in the same order of business as that of the previous cities of Ai and Makkedah and Jericho. And the king of Libnah was struck with the sword. He was hung on the tree. He was buried before sunset in a tomb with the city rubble piled on top of him there in Libnah. From Libnah, they're going to move down to Lachish next. Joshua is on the march. Verse number 31. And Joshua and all Israel with him passed on from Libnah to Lachish, and they camped by it and fought against it. The Lord gave Lachish into the hand of Israel, and he captured it on the second day and struck it and every person who was in it with the edge of the sword, according to all that he had done to Libnah. Then Horam, king of Gezer, came up to him to help Lachish, and Joshua defeated him and his people until he had left him no survivors. So here at Lachish, down here at Lachish, the nation camped outside for a day, and then the next morning they got up and they conquered Lachish. Happened just like it happened in Libnah, just like it happened in Makkedah, just happened like it happened for all these back here at Ai and back at Jericho. Just happened the same way. And they're here in Lachish. The king from Gezer hears about it and says, hey, we got to help. So they come down to Lachish when the battle's going on, and look what happens. Look what happens. What happens here is Joshua defeats the men and king of Gezer down here at Lachish. You notice that the king of Lachish is not mentioned in this passage. And there's a reason why the king of Lachish is not mentioned here. It's because he was killed because he was hiding in the cave in Makkedah in the last chapter where Joshua had already killed him. And they didn't have another king yet. So he died there and was buried. So Lachish is without a king at the time that this city is come and defeated. Gezer, that's Horam, comes down. He was not in the cave. He comes down. He gets defeated. So from Lachish, Joshua marched on to Eglon in verse 34. And Joshua and all Israel with him passed on from Lachish to Eglon. And they camped by it and fought against it. They captured it on that day and struck it with the edge of the sword, and he utterly destroyed that day every person who was in it, according to all that he had done to Lachish. So Eglon is here. It was almost due east of, just down south a little bit, of Lachish, about 2 miles. And when the nation arrives at Eglon, they set up camp, and they move that day, and they slay Eglon the day they got there. There is no mention of a king here in Eglon in this passage. Why? Because he was killed back at Makkedah because he was hiding in the cave. He died with those other kings in the cave. So Eglon did not have any leadership, and so the destruction was easy. The battle was handled just as in the previous cases with Jericho, with Ai, with Makkedah, with Lachish, with Libnah, it's all handled the same way, just as it was in that previous chapter. From Eglon, then Joshua moves all and marches over towards Hebron. Verse 36. Then Joshua and all Israel with him went up from Eglon to Hebron, and they fought against it. They captured it and struck it and its kings and all its cities and all the persons who were in it with the edge of the sword. He left no survivors, according to all that he had done to Eglon. And he utterly destroyed every person who was in it. Hebron was about 20 miles east of Eglon. About 20 miles east. There's no mention of a king in Hebron. Do you know why? He was killed at Makkedah. He was one of the 5 killed at Makkedah. So the city of Hebron is unprotected, and they can take it very easy. From Hebron, they move on down to short distance, down to Debir. Joshua marched there. Verse 38. Then Joshua and all Israel with him returned to Debir, and they fought against it. He captured it and its king and all its cities, and struck them with the edge of the sword, and utterly destroyed every person who was in it. He left no survivors. Just as he had done to Hebron, so he did to Debir and its king, as he had also done in Libnah and its king. Do not be confused here. There was a king, one of the 5 kings at Makkedah, who was killed because he was killed by Joshua. Debir is the name of a king, and it's also the name of a city. And the name of the city is here. This city has a king. Debir, the king of Debir, was not killed at Makkedah. He was killed by Joshua when they attacked here. And what did they do to him? Slayed him with a sword, hung him on a tree. Sunset takes him down, buries him under the rubble of what? The rubble of the town of Debir. From Debir, they go to the Negev. Now, my map's not big enough here to show this anyway. So they're going to head south down here, down into the Negev, all the way down to the Sea of Aqaba, which is going to be part of the promised land, the bottom tip of the part of the promised land of Israel, even as it is today. So I'll be showing those to you here on the visuals on our video. So Joshua marched here in verse 40. Thus Joshua struck all the land, the hill country, and the Negev, and the lowland, and the slope, and all their kings. He left no survivors, but he utterly destroyed all who breathed, just as the Lord, the God of Israel, had commanded. And so there you see as he moves south, he moves down into Beersheba. There's other places that are here. The writer does not record all the names of the cities and the villages taken there in the Negev, but it was because all these cities down here in the Negev, there's a whole bunch of them. And it included Kadesh Barnea, from which the spies went out 40 years before to spy out the land, a place called the name of Gaze, a place called the name of Beersheba, Mizpah, Ramon, Dimona, and Elat. These are just cities that are down there, and Joshua took them all. And then the scripture in verse 41 says they went from the Negev to Goshen. Joshua marched towards that. Joshua struck them from Kadesh Barnea, even as far as Gaza, and all the country of Goshen, even as far as Gibeon. Joshua captured all these kings and their lands at one time because the Lord, the God of Israel, fought for Israel. Look at that map. They're in the Negev, and right about where the word Negev is the place called Kadesh Barnea. From Kadesh Barnea, they marched west towards Goshen and went to Goshen. Goshen is in Egypt. It is where they had left 40 years before when they left Egypt out of the land of Goshen. Joshua marched over there and took it. Why? Because Jacob had made that trip over there too. Every place that the foot of Jacob had been set was to be part of the promised land. From the Nile River where Goshen is, all the way back to the Negev and up to the Gaza. You see that little dotted line there where Gaza is. Gaza's a little town right there. They did not take the Philistine area. You'll see right above the arrow it says Gaza Strip. Joshua and them never took the Gaza Strip. They did not capture it. It has always belongs to the Philistines, even to today in our lives. So Kadesh Barnea and Gaza, they're located there just north and everything, and there at the Negev. And so this whole swath that goes over to the land of Goshen and back up through all what the Lord is saying here, what the writer is saying is all through the central area. They've gotten all this central, they've gotten all the southern over to the land of Goshen and everything back up. And now it's time for them to turn and to go north. To turn and to go north. Every place so far that Abraham, Isaac, remember Abraham went over into Egypt also. Isaac went over to Egypt. Every place where Isaac, Egypt, and Jacob had marched and walked was now taken. And Joshua took that land because he walked it also. And it fulfills the promise to all four men. From Goshen back to Gilgal. From Goshen, the nation marches straight back to Gilgal where they came, where they camped the very first time. The main part of the camp, the women and children and all of that are still stationed at Gilgal. We find that in verse 43. So Joshua and all Israel with him returned to camp at Gilgal. So they go up to where the word Gilgal is, and if you'll notice the little arrow points up to the north of the Dead Sea, that's where Gilgal is located. So from Goshen to Gilgal, Joshua encountered not one conflict. No conflict at all, because it all belongs to the nation of Israel. They've taken the central, they've taken the southern, and it all belongs to Israel. And it's taken some time to do it. Well, the central and southern conquests were complete, and the land was in the hands of Israel, and the nation was at rest in Gilgal for a short time. It was now time for the conquest of the north of northern Canaan. So from Gilgal to Merom, Joshua marched in chapter 11, verse 1. Then it came about, when Jabin, king of Hazor, heard of it, that he sent to Jobab, king of Madon, and to the king of Shimron, and the king of Ascapha, and to the kings who were on the north in the hill country, and in the Arabah, south of the Chinnereth, and in the lowlands, and on the heights of Dor on the west, to the Canaanite on the east and on the west, and the Amorite, and the Hittite, and the Perizzite, and the Jebusite in the hill country, and the Hivite at the foot of Hermon, to the land of Mizpah. They came out, they and all their armies with them, as many people as the sands on the seashore, with very many horses and chariots. So all these kings, having agreed to meet, came and encamped together at the waters of Merom to fight against Israel. Now I want you to look down at the bottom of that map, right in the middle, and you'll see the word Gilgal. And from there they'll slip over to Ai, go up through Mount Gerizim, Mount Ebal, past Shechem, up through Shimron. You hear these names, we just read them, up to the Lake of Miriam. Now I always draw the Sea of Galilee and Lake Chinnereth, or Kinnereth, but we know that it's the Sea of Galilee. So I always draw the Dead Sea and the Sea of Galilee. But north of the Sea of Galilee, there is a little lake up there, a little area, and it's called Lake Merom. And that right there in that red is where all these kings met. They have made the same mistakes that the Amorite kings made when they were fearful and came up outside of Gibeon. They have come and they have gotten in one place. And all Joshua has to do is attack the Canaanites at the lake of Merom. And many of these Canaanites would run towards Sidon and the coast of that great sea, the Mediterranean Sea. And Joshua is going to chase them over there. That's all he's got to do. The Lord has arranged so that these kings have put themselves together for destruction. Verse 6 says this. Then the Lord said to Joshua, do not be afraid because of them, for tomorrow at this time I will deliver all of them slain before Israel. You shall hamstring their horses and burn their chariots with fire. So Joshua and all the people of war with him came upon them suddenly by the waters of Merom and attacked them. Then the Lord delivered them into the hands of Israel so that they defeated them and pursued them as far as Great Sidon and Mizrephoth Marim and the valley of Mizpah to the east, and they struck them until no survivor was left to them. Joshua did to them as the Lord had told them. He hamstrung their horses and burned their chariots with fire. Look at that map. They met there at that little Sea of Miriam. That's where they met them. They then marched out through Hazar and over towards the Mediterranean Sea and up to Sidon and around to the valley of Mizpah. So you see those eras. They just took it all. Valley there of Mizpah is just south of Mount Hermon, which is going to be right in the part of the Promised Land. They've taken it all. This nation was successful with the Lord. Joshua did not kill the horses, though. He hamstrung them. Well, how did he do that? Well, in order to hamstring a horse, you sever the tendon right behind the knee of the horse on those two hind legs, and they're hamstrung. They're no good anymore. And he landed at Sidon when it was all over then. From Sidon, he goes back to Hazar. Joshua marched back east from the coast, from Sidon, the town of Sidon, the great town of Sidon, and we see that in verse 10. And so then Joshua turned back at that time and captured Hazar and struck its king with the sword. For Hazar formerly was the head of all these kingdoms. He was the one in charge. They struck every person who was in it with the edge of the sword, utterly destroying them. There was no one left who breathed. And he burned Hazar with fire. Joshua captured all the cities of these kings and all their kings, and he struck them with the edge of the sword and utterly destroyed them, just as Moses, the servant of the Lord, had commanded. However, Israel did not burn any cities that stood on their mounds, except Hazar alone, which Joshua burned. All the spoil of these cities and the cattle and the sons of Israel took as their plunder, but they struck every man with the edge of the sword until they had destroyed them. They left no one who breathed. Just as the Lord had commanded Moses his servant, so Moses commanded Joshua. And so Joshua did. He left nothing undone of all that the Lord had commanded Moses. So you see there, you see on that map where they had hit. It seems that the writer eliminated many details. Indeed, the Lord fought for these nations against northern Canaan. Yet the men were still there on foot and with their horses and their carts. The march was harsh. The march was long. Nevertheless, the nation of Israel captured all the land that Hazar had once controlled with all these other kings and owned it as the promised land. Now the writer gives us a summary of the conquest of all Canaan land and the extent of the capture. And we find that here in verse 16. Thus Joshua took all the land, the hill country, and all the Negev, all that land of Goshen, the lowland, and the Arba, the hill country of Israel and its lowland, from Mount Halak that rises towards Seir, even as far as Baal Gad in the valley of Lebanon at the foot of Mount Hermon. And he captured all their kings and struck them down and put them to death. Joshua waged war a long time with all these kings. There's you a map of the extent of what Joshua took. Everything there that is in that map, they had walked across and they had conquered, except for a little portion right there called the Gaza Strip. Now, if we make Goshen in Egypt, the furthest point to the southwest of Israel, and Mount Hermon, the furthest point north of Israel. The nation of Israel had marched 262 miles if there was a road that would run from Goshen all the way around right up to Mount Hermon, from one to the other. But no road exists. In addition, the nation fought all the way to the south to the Negev, 144 miles further on down to the Negev, down to the Sea of Aqaba, and that city that's right there on the tip of the northern tip of that Sea of Aqaba. Then we must consider the nation covered every square foot, the full width of Canaan land from north to south. Much more than 8,000 square miles in their campaign they marched. It took a long time, the verse said. All the Canaanites were destroyed except for the Gibeonites. All the kings were killed, and it took Joshua a long time. But as I said, there was that exception. From the extent of the capture, we come to the exception of the capture here in verse 19a. There was not a city which made peace with the sons of Israel except the Hivites living in Gibeon. So after mentioning the exception there of the capture, the writer then turns to the extermination of the capture. He speaks first of the destruction of the Canaanites in verse 19b. They took them all in battle, for it was of the Lord to harden their hearts, to meet Israel in battle in order that he might utterly destroy them, that they might receive no mercy, but that he might destroy them, just as the Lord had commanded Moses. So then we see the destruction of Anakim. See, the Lord's taking care of all the Canaanites, but now we've got some problem people. They're called Anakim. So the writer here speaks of the destruction of Anakim in verse 21. Then, after he's done everything else in the land, Joshua came at that time and cut off the Anakim from the hill country, from Hebron, from Debir, from Anab, and from all the hill country of Judah, and from all the hill country of Israel. Joshua utterly destroyed them with their cities. There were no Anakim left in the land of the sons of Israel. Only in Gaza, in Gath, and in Ashdod some remained. Now here's what I got to tell you about that. Gath, Ashdod, and Gaza were all part of the Gaza Strip. Joshua did not take what we call the Gaza Strip. So before the time, I'm going to back up and give you some history here. Before the time of Joshua's campaign, the Anakim lived in southern Canaan. And they lived there by main headquarters was there by Hebron. And it was the name Anakim means long-necked. And it was often said that these were giants, and their presence surely scared the majority of the spies, I tell you that Moses sent to Hebron 40 years before. But they were not a race of giants. They were long-necked, and they were tall and big, but they were not giants. And we see that in Numbers chapter 13, verse 28, and Deuteronomy chapter 9, 2. But Anak was the father of the tribe that grew to be known as the Anakims. And it seemed that that race grew over time and was divided into three different groups. There's three different groups of them. And after Joshua destroyed the Anakim, he destroyed them all except over in Gaza, Gath, and Ashdod. And those are cities of the Philistine territory. And we will hear about them again in Judges 1:20, chapter 1, verse 20. But after that, they will never be mentioned again after they are taken care of within the book of Judges. So from that, we go from the extermination of the capture. The writer then comes and ends with the expiration of the capture here in verse 23. So Joshua took the whole land, according to all that the Lord had spoken to Moses. And Joshua gave it for an inheritance to Israel according to their divisions by their tribes. Thus the land rest from war. The war was over. The Canaanites had been destroyed. Almost all the Anakim had been destroyed. The land was taken. The land from Goshen up to Mount Hebron, Mount Hermon belonged to the Israelites. But as we will see, not all of the land Joshua could have taken was actually taken. And we're going to discuss that soon. But for now, in this story, the nation of Israel is back at the camp of Gilgal. We're back there at the Gilgal, in that part of the promised land. They're going to go through the process of dividing the promised land among the different 12 tribes, among the different divisions in each tribe, and among each family of each tribe. And one of the things that we will see of all this over 8,000 square miles, each family is going to receive, at the order of Joshua, about 12 acres per family. It was a huge project that they got into. And once those 5 Amorite kings had gone against them at Gibeon, Joshua and Israel could not turn back. They had to move. They had to go ahead and take the rest move out of the central area and take the rest of the southern area. They had to move on down into the Negev, way down here. They had to move over to Goshen because it was over to the Nile River. Because you see, the Promised Land runs from the Nile River to the River Euphrates. But they did not make it to the River Euphrates. But we'll discuss that in another time, coming up in the book of Joshua. They have to take it all from the whole width of it all the way around. And they've done it. And we'll find out how long it took. But that will happen the next time we come together. When you face a large project, especially a project for the Lord, when you get into it, you've got to stick with it. But you have to encounter the Lord also. Because when the Lord is with you, you will always have victory.